Welcome to Summer Camp. This is the first installment of the Modern Mystery Quilt. It's so fun. It's so fun to get started again.
And we're so excited to see what you will all do. This is, we always say, it's a mystery quilt, unlike any that you've done. We love surprises. We love twists and turns. So the structure of this will be a little different from what you're expecting.
You know, a lot of times people get mystery quilts. They're given fabrics that they need to use, or paint chips or colors that they are required to use. And what we try to do is give you the opportunity to learn and explore. And if you want to use your own stash, be able to use your own stash.
So we always say it's not a class, but you're going to learn a lot along the way. And because we have hundreds of people participating, we get lots of really good questions in the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics Facebook group, where we kind of have the progress of this unfolding. We try to get to your questions, but please don't take it personally if we miss something. We're trying to keep orders flowing and we're making our quilt, but there's a wonderful community here and you are great at supporting each other.
So this video will talk about the structure of the Quiltalong and fabric selection and color and the units and blocks that you'll be making.
Yeah, so the first part is basically general, and then we'll talk a little bit about this installment one. And if you haven't watched it, we had a kind of pre-release video that introduced the kind of concept of different ways, different palettes you could use, how to work with prints or solids. If you haven't seen that, please go back and watch that, because today we're going to talk more about color, and we're going to be using our palette as kind of the
example.
Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah.
Example.
Yeah. But you know, I think it's worth mentioning that in our Quiltalong from January, our New Day Quiltalong, there were some people who were surprised how much time we spent talking about color, and they said, "Oh my goodness, this is so much more complicated." But I think what they did was they found that later on, everything was just so much easier because they had a palette that was well considered and that they had edited carefully. So it's worth your time to spend some energy editing your palette and auditioning things, so the final quilt will be something that will go together easily and that you won't have to remake sections.
Exactly. So I'd like to start talking a bit about just the structure here. As you know, on the Lodge, your secret web page, we have the calendar of dates where we're releasing installments and the supporting videos. You're going to have 2 weeks between installment 1 and installment 2, and subsequently they'll be 1 week apart. This gives you a little more time to finalize your palette, order fabrics if you need that.
Or totally change your palette.
If
you think about color in a new way, or decide you want to use solids instead of prints, or prints instead of solids.
Yeah.
Any of that works.
And decide what size. This is different from our last Quiltalong. We have 3 size options. There's a small lap quilt, there's a napping quilt, and there's a queen size quilt. And all of them are going to require lots of cutting, different blocks, different units. So one of the most important things is organization. You're going to be getting 6 installments, and we try to make this really user-friendly. So the installments will be often on 8 or 10 sheets of paper, because we're doing things a little differently here. If you have, let's say, 4 blocks or units that you make in an installment, each one will be on a separate sheet of paper. So you can work with one page in front of you at any given time.
Makes things a little bit easier to find.
It makes it really easy to find.
Easier to stay organized.
And there's another reason, but I can't totally give it away.
Yeah.
You'll see, because obviously you have access to this first installment. But there is one of the first twists that you're discovering is that not everyone is making the same blocks or units.
And it's also worth just pausing for a second to just remind you, please don't share any parts of this pattern online, on any social media platform, including in the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns in Fabrics group, because that is a public group, and there are people who will ask you to send links to the pattern because they don't want to pay for it or whatever. But even if you're if you're posting pictures of your progress, which we encourage, if you could make sure that the printouts aren't visible, because sometimes they have the URL on the top of the page.
Yeah, we don't want to give away the secret pages and access. And so that's a great thing to keep in mind. So when you get, when the date comes that the installment is released, you'll go to that secret page called the Lodge, and you can download the installment for that week. We encourage you to print it out right away. And to keep it organized, we're suggesting a 3-ring binder or a clipboard.
But it's going to be a lot of pages.
It's going to be a lot of pages. So for me, I have basically the first welcome letter printed out. And then after that, every installment will start with a welcome page that has some interesting questions on it.
And we suggest that you watch the video for the installment before you read through the page, because sometimes it will help you, it'll set you up nicely.
It will set you up, yes. And then there will be individual pages for each of the blocks or units that you can make. And because we have 3 sizes, at the bottom of every page, it tells you how many of those blocks or units you need to make. I think it should be very clear. It is, to me, exciting to...
It's fun.
It's fun.
It's really fun.
And it is summer, so even though there's a lot to print out, the sewing should be relaxing. There aren't curves. There are no finicky templates. Well, there are no templates whatsoever. And I keep trying to figure out how to say this. The fact that no 2 of you will be making the same blocks and units.
The combination.
Yeah. You'll make a lot of the same ones, but between different choices, different colors, there's going to be fun variety.
So you'll notice if you've printed out the first installment instructions, you'll notice there are lots of choices. And those choices were written by 2 of us who grew up in the United States, and there are some cultural associations with childhood.
And American summer.
American summer, and specifically kind of East Coast, Midwest summer that may be different if you live in other parts of the country. Or world, yes. So if there are some cultural references that you don't understand, feel free to substitute your own cultural references. And we would love it if you would share those cultural references.
We want to hear your stories.
I think
share
part
it in
of
the
what's
Facebook
going to be
group.
fun is that this whole experience is going to be sharing what each other's summer childhoods and adulthoods, what are the icons and memories that you have of summer, and integrate them into your block selections.
Yes, and so we're kind of trying to tap into a little nostalgia and storytelling and sharing. So you'll get it when you read it.
Yeah.
Now, because there are a lot of blocks and a lot of choices, organization is going to be important. We are pretty organized people.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. I have right here, I have a bin that I put blocks as I make them, and I label them, and I have clips and pieces of paper, and I keep my 2 trimming rulers really handy. This is not a shameless plug, but because we're working with smaller blocks, our good measure, square up ruler and trimming ruler are fantastic. If you already have rulers, you don't need anything. But if you're in the market for kind of like easy to use, nicely marked one, I love them.
And the other thing that's really nice about these rulers is that because they're printed, the numbers are printed on the underside, underneath the coating. If you need to put a Sharpie or put a piece of tape or something on the top, they're not going to affect the printing. I just saw somebody
I use tape all the time.
Yeah, on social media talking about they put some tape to mark, a width onto their ruler, and it wrecked their it took off the markings for the measurements, and our rulers, because they're printed on the underside, don't do that. So that is a really helpful.
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
and I'm always using tape, but I hadn't thought to Sharpie. Now I'm going to do that.
Now you can Sharpie.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, if you have little bins or Ziploc bags, if you participated in our previous Quiltalong, you know that this is a little different because you're getting instructions every week, which means you might be cutting 3 of these, 4 of these, 1 of these. So you handle your stash a lot. It's not like a pattern that starts out with cutting instructions where you can do all your cutting at once. We're constantly going back and forth with the stash. So it's fun. Is it the most efficient? Not necessarily.
But it's more fun.
It's more fun.
Yeah.
And it lets you make color choices as you go. So I think ultimately I love working this way because I'm paying attention to every block as I make it. I'm not just mechanically acting like a machine that cuts it and then sews A to B.
And you're not spending hours and hours if you have issues with your hands. Sometimes cutting out a queen size quilt, will take you, hours and hours, and it'll be rough on your hands. And what's nice about this approach is that all you have to do is focus on just those units for that week. So it's like you're making little teeny, almost kind of like mug rug size, pieces, several a week. And so you're just focusing on one thing at a time. And I find it just much more relaxing than having, than saying like, oh, cut 235 triangles, from 10 different fabrics. So, but you are going to want to stay organized in terms of, it's not the case that you're going to get all the cutting at once and then you put everything away.
Yeah.
So
each page is like a little project.
Exactly.
In most cases, it's something you could do in half an hour to an hour and a half per block or something. It depends.
Depends on the size you're going to make.
And everyone is going to be making different choices.
And some blocks and some units will be easier than others.
Yes.
But
no one would call this hard.
No. It's simple sewing, but
everyone should call it fun.
There are a lot of seams sometimes, but there are straight lines, so it should be easier. The other thing is that you will want to make sure that you understand, if you haven't done a Quiltalong with us before, that you might have something that looks like a finished block. But we may go back to that, and you may do something else to that unit or to that block later. So we're giving you finished measurements and everything of each unit because people have told us that is reassuring to them. Mm-hmm. However, just because you made something in installment 1 that looks like it could be in a quilt right now doesn't mean that something else in installment 4 you might refer back to that. So that's why it's a good idea to keep everything labeled, so you'll say, oh, here are my installment 1 units or whatever. So I think that gives you a sense of the structure. What we'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about color and color choices.
So these installments will be coming weekly, but you can work at your own pace. It's summer. You might have someone visiting for a few days and you can't sew that week. You may be lucky and going to the beach, but there will be such an even pace that don't worry if you miss a week and you have to catch up, you'll be able to do that. It's not a race. Just as you work, you can post your progress. As noted in the introduction and on the Lodge page, the only thing we ask is when you get near the end that you don't post finished quilts before the reveal date, and we'll talk more about that later.
I think it's really important to reiterate the point that Bill just made. You know, when Bill and I have done long distance cycling in large events like fundraisers where, you ride 65 miles in a day or whatever. And when we used to ride with our daughter, and there would be people who would zoom past us at 22 miles an hour on their bikes. The speedies, as we called them. And, we always told our daughter, let them go. They are welcome to go ahead. That's what works for them. But you ride your own ride. And there are people who, within, I want to say, like 6 hours of us announcing the yardage, already had their, I've completed my fabric selection. And if you love to do that, have at it. But we also want you to enjoy the process. This is a very process-oriented quilt-along, and our whole approach to quilting is to meet you where you are, and for you to feel like, if you don't finish this for a year, but you've printed out all of your, if you've had somebody just message me this morning that they're having shoulder surgery on June 1st, and can they do it later in the year? Of course, of course. So don't get freaked out. Nobody's going to be left behind. No. Don't worry if you're sewing at a slower pace than other people. It's not a race, and there's no prize for finishing first.
But I will say, I also enjoy I enjoy seeing what the speedies do. It's kind of fun.
Yes.
It reveals itself along.
But sometimes the speedies change their mind. They get a little flat tire on the way. So any pace is welcome.
And next thing to say is, we actually have 2 of our live stream quilt firsts on Facebook during this quilt along. So on June 1st, which is today,
yes.
Later today, or depending on when you watch this, at noon on June 1st, we'll have our monthly live stream, Quilts First, and we'll be able to address questions you have, give some more details. And so if you can join us for that, that would be great. If you are not available during the time of the live stream, which is noon Central Daylight Time, we also record it and post it on our YouTube channel. Then July 1st will be another Quilts First. So that will be kind of deep in the thick of the quilt along. And once again, if people have questions, we'll address them during that.
We try to, I feel like, we, at least with the last quilt along, we spent hours and hours and hours a day answering questions on the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics page, because there would occasionally be misunderstandings, or clarification would be needed. There would be people who weren't participating in it who might send people off in the wrong direction, maybe with no ill intention, but just that they didn't really understand what it was about, and they were trying to give them a shortcut or something. But we can't realistically respond to every email and look at every single person's palette. So please don't take it personally. We go through the feed and we try to answer as many as we can and react and encourage you. But, there are hundreds and hundreds of people involved, and So we need to, it's not realistic to assume we're going to be able to give everybody individual attention.
Absolutely. So now we'd like to kind of dive into our fabric selection and discussion of fabric selection. So do you want to...
And yours.
And yours, obviously, yes.
Yeah. So we decided to use solids because people tell us that they have a difficult time using solids and they don't know where to start sometimes. However, you are welcome to use tone-on-tones or small scale multicolored prints, even like Liberty prints and that kind of thing would work for this. The things that wouldn't work, as we discussed in the first video, were high contrast prints or large scale prints. So the cave prints, the tulip prints, there's a lot of those.
Or directional prints.
Yes.
Directional prints can sometimes be tricky. Other times they can work well. It's hard. If you're super comfortable with stripes and love stripes, you could probably do something awesome with stripes.
But you're gonna have to be very thoughtful about how you use those stripes.
Yeah, but in general, we're looking for more all over prints.
Yeah.
And I also want to clarify, Week said we decided to use solids because we know some of you struggle with them. We didn't do it to make it hard. We didn't give the opportunity
to understand how to use them better.
It's
to learn.
kind of a learning
Absolutely.
chance.
It's kind of an educational opportunity.
Yeah.
But one of the questions I've seen a lot is, can I mix solids with tone-on-tones? And this is, I've thought so much about this because I've been asked this question hundreds of times. And I find that solids, because they're so flat, and it's kind of like, solids are very flat, and then prints have more kind of
depth,
volume to them almost, and more depth. So I find that prints look a little like a black hole to me, and call too much attention to themselves when they're mixed with tone-on-tones. However, I think it's really important to understand, to state that this isn't science. There's a lot of taste involved here. And if it doesn't bother you, feel free to do it. I don't want to be, I don't want it to be perceived that we're saying there are rules here, because there are, the way that the color looks may be well, it's just important that we explain why we don't do that, but then you make your own choices.
I think prints and solids can work together in certain quilts. However, when it's a mystery quilt and you don't know exactly what role each fabric plays in the final quilt, I think that's where it gets tricky. Because if you have a pattern and you can figure out the placement of the solids and the prints ahead of time, you can make them fit the structure of the quilt. Because you don't have all the information ahead of time in a mystery quilt, I would tend to say stick to prints or stick to solids. But you may do differently as well.
Yeah, I think we're explaining why we're not doing that.
Yes.
And we're explaining, and I think this kind of, to step back to make a larger point here. It's really important that you understand that when we give you feedback on, social media or in these videos, where we give you guidance, we're not telling you what to do because we are trying to control you or, create rules or whatever. We're trying to help you be successful because we know we're trained designers, and we know what the finished quilt looks like, and we've taught thousands and thousands and thousands of students, and we've made a lot of quilts. So, it's always your choices, your quilt, your quilt, your choices. It's always that. So if we're giving you advice, it's because we want you to avoid frustration it's not because we want you to do it our way.
We're always
We're just trying to be helpful.
We're always trying to understand when we look, if you post a palette, we're trying to understand what you're seeking to achieve, and we're trying to help you get there.
Exactly. We're not trying to make you make our quilt.
No, we're making our quilt. You don't need to make our quilt.
Exactly.
So, but if you want to, join us.
Yeah. We're using a multicolored palette. You are welcome to use, some people have said, do we need to have it be multicolored? Can it be one color or two colors? Any combination works as long as you have contrast within the group of fabrics that you're going to be using for the pieced blocks and units. So if you want to use all browns or all greens or greens and yellows, that's fine. It does not need to be, there's no kind of limitation on how many colors you use or how few colors you use.
Oh, with fabrics, though, we suggest you have at least 16 fabrics.
16 fabrics, but you can have 16 green fabrics as long as there's contrast.
I just want to be clear there.
Yes. So we always pre-wash our fabrics and encourage you to do so as well. We understand that this is a controversial topic. However, we've just had so many people call us heartbroken hundreds of phone calls where there has been a fabric that has bled. And those of you who are using cherry wood fabrics in particular, because I've seen some of you on the Patterns and Fabrics page using that, Synthropol the heck out of that because it does.
And retain both.
Yes, and retain.
Because those bleed 100% of the time unless you really prepare them well. They're beautiful, but you have to prepare them.
You've really got to be careful with them. We don't use starch, but we do use a lot of steam. And so there's, again, very controversial. If you have a new iron or an old iron, be sure to read the instructions, because sometimes it requires distilled water, sometimes it requires the tap water. So all of that you're going to see us talk about, but as always, you do what works for you. And if you want if you're using yarn dyes, for example, and you need a little bit of stiffness to the fabrics, we use Mary Ellen's Best Press, and very occasionally, but most of the time we just use steam.
Yeah, so there'll be a lot of individual process. And as always, those of you who are active on the Facebook group, discuss this and share your tips along the way.
But you do you.
Yep, exactly. So then, if we move into color now, every single time we teach, every time we do a quilt along, we have a very quick color discussion just to make things clear for everyone. And we always want to make sure that there are 3 words that we've defined well, because we'll use them throughout the quilt along.
And we ask you to use these words as well, because it makes the communication more clear.
It does. And although the color wheel isn't an essential part of this, it can be helpful as we talk about the 3 words. The first word that we use all the time is hue, and that would refer to any of these spokes like yellow, green, blue, violet, red, orange. Often people use that term synonymously with color, but basically the hue would be, if you pulled out the crayon from the crayon box, what's it called? Then the next term that quilters are always familiar with is value, and that's the relative lightness or darkness. So you can have kind of a light blue to a deep midnight blue. You could have a light green all the way to a deep forest green.
So this, you can see value within this color wheel, and that the lighter values are in the center and the darker values are on the edge.
And then the final term, which is very important to us and often the most confusing to quilters, is saturation. Saturation is the intensity of a color. So quilters usually use the term brightness. Is a color bright, or is it dusty or muddy? Technically, that is saturation. So the saturation you can think of as the purity of the color. Like a totally bright, pure, intense red is different from a faded, weathered red that's been on a barn for 20 years.
It's different from value.
Yes.
And we'll show you some examples of that in a few minutes.
And rather than do a big color lecture right now, what we want to do is show you the palette we're using, talk about how we made those decisions, and use examples of hue, value, and saturation in our palette. So once again, we're not telling you need to use our palette. No. But we think that it's a good case study that explains these terms. All the discussion and teaching we're doing during these videos is to help you with confidence as you make decisions. There are countless gizmos and formulaic approaches and books that tell you how you should choose colors. We're generally not big fans of anything that's a formula because it tends to lack the depth and nuance that really makes a quilt beautiful or unusual or individual. So there's a lot of good information in those books often, but we see them as a starting point, not an
end. It's
a
little simplistic. It's if it were that simple, paintings over thousands of years could have all just been done with some little $8, wheel or whatever that you get at Joann's. So we're taking much more of a kind of design school approach to it, because it will give you a more interesting quilt. It's harder. It would be easier for us to sell you a $7.99 gizmo. Just say this magically you'll get the right color. But what we're trying to do is it's kind of, I often explain it, it's kind of like, teaching you how to do addition or multiplication. We want you to understand the thinking, because then you will be able to refine to a better degree the look that you want for your quilt, instead of everybody having the same quilt because they use the same gizmo from Joann's or whatever.
Exactly. And I'd say about 15% of you did buy the solid starter bundle, which is great. You can actually make the napping quilt using just that starter bundle and one contrasting field fabric.
But it is a starter bundle.
It can be the complete bundle. You can use that and that only. It's enough fabric when you combine it with the yardage for the field. But what we want to do today is show you how we took our starter pack, and we've got a big stash of solids. Not everyone does. So we want to show you how we took that starter bundle and augmented it. So if we can now, we'd like to kind of walk you through how we did that.
So, and we'll say ours are already pre-washed and we've already cut into them because we've made the first units and blocks. So they should be frayed on the edges and have a couple wrinkles here and there. So you want to go ahead and talk about the structure of this bundle?
So with the structure, there were 16 fabrics in that starter pack that many of you are using. And if you look, I want to go back to the terms of hue, saturation, and value. So in terms of hue, we've got greens, pinks, oranges, blues, purples. Really goes pretty much all the way around the color wheel. In terms of value, if you think of white as being the lightest and black as being the darkest, we avoided the extremes. So we have kind of a pale green and a pale gray, and we have a slightly darker kind of weathered red and a slight plum. But there's nothing, it's kind of from light medium to medium dark. There's nothing light, there's nothing dark.
Would you pass me the color wheel, please?
Yes, and we can put this
if
here.
You look here, we've eliminated, because we're using this marine for the background fabric, we've eliminated the values on the periphery here, and we've also eliminated the ones in the center ring. But because we have put those constraints on it, then we can work all the way around the color wheel without it being too chaotic. What we see sometimes when with a palette that needs editing is when somebody is trying to use every value and every hue. So if your palette has every value and every hue in it, then there's it becomes very difficult to have contrast with your background fabric, and it can become a little hard to, it's like, herding kittens, it just becomes a little too much. And the quickest way to see whether your palette would be more cohesive would be to eliminate the lightest fabrics in your palette, or eliminate the darkest, or both, and then see what it looks like. Because again, part of this is learning to see color, and I think many people have been led astray by the suggestion that all quilts need a light, medium, and dark, and then they say light, medium, and dark, and then they say I love color, and then they go all the way around, and then pretty much it just becomes a little too much sometimes. And if you need a background fabric, it becomes difficult to find something that you're going to have enough contrast with, because there's nothing missing from here to contrast with this.
So to make this a little more clear, I'll put this on top. We told you in the first video that you're going to assemble a palette with many fabrics, and then there will be one contrasting field fabric that comes into play later. You don't necessarily have to decide exactly what that fabric is now, but you can. I think it helps to make the decisions.
I think though, if you don't, and then you use, let's put it this way. If you don't decide, you need to at least leave a space for that value or that hue, or so you can't use everything then.
Absolutely, because if you look at this, I could probably use a rich brown and it would look great still, because there would be a clear contrast.
But you couldn't use a medium brown.
No, it would
because it's too close to that. So, you could use the ecru, for example.
We talked in our first video that we thought the ecru would also be beautiful with this, although we would have to eliminate that light gray because you don't get any edge. There's no contrast. But for the sake of this quilt along, we are going to be using this combination. So one of the things we did is we went into our stash of solids, and if you look at this bin, do you see from the overhead view, it looks so similar to this in that it doesn't have super darks, it doesn't have super lights, and it goes all the way around the color wheel.
But within that narrow value range.
Yeah. So for instance, we had these kind of melon and papaya colors. We had 3 others in our stash that weren't quite the same. So by adding them in, it will give a bit of depth. It would still look great if we only used these.
Right.
But we had these, so we added.
But we're not adding in navy, and we're not adding in cream, and we're not adding in super lights or super darks, just more of the same. And one of the things that I think is really important is that the goal is not to have everything the same value across the whole palette, or the same saturation even necessarily, but it's to have variety with transitions. So
that's a great word, the transitions.
The transition. So, for example, you don't necessarily want to have the darkest fabric and the lightest fabric and nothing in between those two, unless you want a super graphic quilt, which I guess you could do too.
You could, but it's harder again with a mystery quilt because you don't know how things are being used.
Yeah.
So you may notice that we've just talked about hue and value, but we didn't talk about saturation. What I want, Weeks, if you could hand me this. Thank you. I want to show you examples. I'm going to set that aside for later of fabrics that we had solids in our stash that we did not use. And I want to show you why. So if you look, we have red, blue, green, purple. If we take all of those, can you see right now that these, I'm going to put them across, these are highly saturated. They are bright.
So you want to put them on here so we can,
I'll put them there.
You can see.
If you put some of these in, they would draw so much attention to themselves that even like a little sliver of this in there, it would be distracting most likely.
However, if you had a more narrow range of hues, you were using a variety of pinks, you could have this in there because you would have fewer colors, fewer hues, but you would need some what we call mediation, which is you would need a variety of pinks from this pink to this pink. So you have a transition between the dustiest one and the brightest one. So this is where the grayscale issue comes in.
So a lot of people like to pull out their phones, take pictures, and switch it to black and white to see if anything stands out. The problem with that is that only tells you the value, whether something is light or dark. And for instance, let me use this as an example. If I put this like screaming hot lime fabric in here and took a black and white photo, it would look absolutely fine.
Yeah.
It would just look gray because the black and white gets rid of all the saturation. So yeah, the black and white filter tells you if something's light or dark, but it doesn't tell you anything about the saturation. And we do want variety because this is not a pastel palette. If we look, this is actually, it's not highlighter yellow, but it's certainly brighter than a putty. We have some pinks in here that are a little brighter. So our saturation goes from a little saturated to a little desaturated. Once again, avoiding the extremes.
So that that grayscale,
we miss that.
That grayscale technique that people love so much and post so much in our groups, it has that issue, and then it also has the opposite issue that I've seen, which is people try to make all of the values the same. They say, oh, one of these pops. Well, maybe that's indicating that you need more of that instead of less than that, because it's kind of like food, the texture of food. I always say, like, you don't want baby food where everything is the same texture. You want a little variety for contrast. And sometimes people will buy a bundle of fabrics that are all the same value, all the same saturations, and it is very flat in terms of the color work. And that's not necessarily ideal either. So you want something that's not, the food. I always think about soup, which is like, you want some different textures in there. You don't want everything to be either stand out and then have everything else looks kind of subservient to, the ones that pop out. But you also don't want to necessarily have everything be exactly the same.
And so for those of you who did decide to use the starter bundle, take a look pull it out and take a moment to think about what we've just said so you can look at it and say, oh, I see this range of saturation, this range of value, this range of hue. And those of you who are working with your stash, you can still look at these photos or this video and understand. And I want to show a couple other examples of things we pulled out. For instance, we pulled out this green because it's almost the same value as the blue. It's darker than everything else in the bundle, but it's very close in hue and value and saturation to the field fabric. So if you made a block with this in it, it might not have a very crisp edge.
It might look like there's a hole in the quilt.
And also this may or may not work because it's kind of on video. My guess is this looks really different, but I often look at the palette in a slightly darker room. I'm often curled up with the quilt at night. And so if it were a little darker, these might become more similar.
It's just iffy.
It's iffy.
It's iffy.
And because I'm going to get rid of all this iffy. And I'm going to set that behind me. And I made a sample block just to show you an example of two fabrics we're not using. This deep purple, which I think is just a little iffy, not quite, a little too close to the marine background, and this bright green, which if you put it anywhere here, that green is what will stand out. Now, if you want to make a bright highlighter quilt, great, use lots of those.
Yeah.
But if it's just one or two,
it's going to look like the odd man out.
It's going to be a problem.
The other thing that's worth talking about is the use of neutrals in here. And
Yes.
I think that it's easy to fall in love with colors and choose your favorite colors, but neutrals can really add sophistication to, like, this isn't a rainbow.
No.
And you know, not that there's anything wrong with a rainbow. We love a good rainbow, but adding some neutrals that are very desaturated into, along with a bunch of other colors, it really transforms the palette. And you can see
kind of without and with, and then we added, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about a half dozen more, because they just break everything up.
Yeah.
And
and they just make everything feel a little bit more elevated and sophisticated. So, you know, it doesn't have to be all rainbow or all neutrals, mixing neutrals. And we often, you know, we know and admire Kay Fassett and his color work in particular. He's really masterful with color. And everybody thinks of his fabrics as so bright, but when you take a second and you'll notice that there's a fabric with hot pink in it, but right next to it, what you're not noticing is that there's an olive, or there's a taupe color,
or like a mushroom,
or some kind of mustard color, and you don't see it, but it's there in the background. And I always think of it as the kind of salted caramel effect, that those neutrals make the brights feel brighter without everything being totally overwhelming. So it's a subtle addition to a palette, but if you have, if you're working from your stash, and that's why we included it in the starter pack, just to kind of introduce some neutrals in there. But if you're working with your own stash, or you're working with some of our palettes of the month where there's only 10 fabrics, consider adding a couple of neutrals in there. The one thing that I probably wouldn't add in there is black. A lot of people have asked about using black as their background fabric. A lot of people. And the comment is almost always, it really makes the colors pop. And that is true. Black does do that.
Because it's high contrast.
However, it can also make it stark. So if you love black, use it. But before you jump on to black, maybe look at charcoal gray, or maybe look at
eggplant,
or espresso brown, or
cypress.
Yes.
Oh, we have a solid called cypress that it's a desaturated dark green with brings everything to life.
But black can go really stark really fast, and we use black and like black, and there's a lot of great quilts that are made with black. However, I don't default to it.
That's a good way to think of it.
And same thing with white.
If you default to it because it works, because like with white and black, they're used so commonly because they have successful contrast with almost everything else, But if you just tiptoe out of that comfort zone and go for an ecru or a celadon instead of white, or you go for espresso or eggplant or forest instead of black, you might find that it makes the quilt even richer.
And then also just because it's so commonly used, I feel like it's a missed opportunity to not at least audition something else before, and you may end up back at black, but...
And I also want to say that all of this discussion is especially important because we are working with solids. So when Weeks talked about the K-Facet prints, he may have 15 different colors in one print. When you're working with solids, you have one color. So the quilt becomes that melting pot. And that's why you mix the desaturated and the saturated, the neutrals, all of that works within the whole quilt, often in a similar way that colors ordinarily intermingle in a complex print.
Yeah.
So it is different also with a solid. You don't have a theme fabric that you're pulling colors from. You're building, you can almost think of this as one big theme fabric. That's the entire quilt.
Exactly.
And like if these were all in one fabric, you might just love that fabric.
Yeah. And so, you know, as Bill said, you don't have to determine your background color right now, but
it's helpful.
To quote Taylor Swift, you need to leave a blank space for it. You need to make sure that there is room for it to have contrast.
Yes.
So determine whether you want light, determine whether you want dark, determine whether you want a blue or whatever. And then you can go back to it. But you need to leave a space for it because otherwise
that's perfect.
you start making your quilt and then you're like, I've used all the colors and all the values and there's, I'm going to have a hard time finding contrast.
So this is a lot of introductory information. Future supporting videos are going to be much shorter because we'll just be talking about the installment. And we do want to talk about this installment. I'm going to give you a little bit of information.
But part of the installment is the color work too.
Oh, yeah. But I'm going to just, if I may, give you those. And I'm going to pull my magic basket back out. Now, here's the caveat. Your blocks are going to likely be different. Your palettes will be different. So I'm just going to show some of what we've done.
And can I just interject and say, we're not going to tell you what fabric to put where. That is going to be your choice. We only suggest that you choose contrasting fabrics and that you not try to make a matchy block because you're committing to the entire palette. So don't try to make... You will end up, if you don't use, for example, if you use two pinks together, a blue and a green together, and then you're just going to end up with odd man out kind of colors at the end. So try to mix in those neutrals early on. Try to mix across the color wheel early on, so all of the fabrics are integrated into the units and blocks you'll be making.
And sometimes you might be making 2 blocks. Sometimes you might be making 8 blocks. And you can mix and match colors around with the blocks. I'm just going to show you some examples of these really quickly.
And these would be
the
iced tea blocks.
You'll find out more.
Yes, if you haven't read them already.
And then I'm going to put my ice cream sandwich blocks. Now, you'll understand why when you see the pattern. It doesn't mean these look like ice cream sandwiches. It's just a reference.
Yes.
But you can begin to see that blocks can be very different and have their different proportions of color, little slivers. You can see how the palette starts to work its way around. And you'll generally have anywhere from a dozen to 24 blocks or units that you make every week. And like for me, I told you earlier, you have to handle the fabric a lot. You cut, you sew, but I love making a beautiful little block. To me, this is satisfying. It's much more satisfying than spending 2 hours cutting and then 2 hours sewing.
Right.
So we cut lots of pieces. rearrange them. And we know that like every block doesn't have to be something that you would frame and put on the wall.
Exactly.
Like personally, not my favorite colors. I think the block's going to be awesome in the quilt because the palette is good.
Exactly. You're committing to the palette, not the colors in an individual unit or
and
block.
That can be a hard thing, especially with solids, where you might put these together and say like, I don't love the color, but I love the role of the color.
And then you got to go back and look at the entire palette to make sure that you really like the entire palette.
And there will be all sorts of different things happening. So I don't want to, I'm not laying all of them out. Last mystery quilt, we laid out everything we did. I'll probably lay out more that we do in subsequent videos.
Right.
But we want to have some surprise with reading and watching this.
Right.
So I think we're ready for people to have a good
sew?
summer.
Yeah. So we're going to have, we mentioned in the schedule, how that we're going to give you 2 weeks to refine your palettes and to start sewing. And for some people who might be waiting for fabric from us to arrive,
it's coming. Sorry.
We've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of orders to fill. So you should have plenty of time in the next 2 weeks. Even if your fabric hasn't arrived yet, don't worry about it.
It's getting there.
It's on its way.
As soon as we send out fabric, we get more fabric, and then we send out more fabric, and it's exciting.
It's getting, but you will have plenty of time to get it done. And there will be, we'll announce ahead of time, and we're going to have little campfire chats. And there's going to be lots of
more fun
activities
along the way.
In the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks.
So those campfire chats we'll announce. They'll just be kind of fun evening get-togethers every now and then.
Exactly.
So
welcome.
Welcome to camp.
We're going to have fun.
I feel like a real camp counselor with my 3-ring binder.
No, you need the clipboard.
Oh yeah, I've got the clipboard too.
So if you haven't joined us on Facebook and you are a Facebook user, join us there. We also monitor YouTube and
Instagram.
So we will try to answer as many questions as we can, but there's a wealth of resource with other quilters as well. So
yeah, we've got such great campers.
Yes, and we will look forward to a fun yet relaxing summer quilt along with you.
Absolutely. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be sewing, we'll be cutting.
See you later.
Bye-bye.